Hello, folks. Thank you for tuning into another episode of the Federalist Files. We'll be covering Federalist number 52. It is titled The House of Representatives, written by James Madison, February 8th, 1788. Topics include state governments will regulate elections, the qualifications of the House of Representatives, and representatives should be reliant on the will of the people. So first I wanted to just say I want to thank everybody. The channel has, or the program rather, has been doing better and better over the last couple of months. We're starting to pick up steam. Rumble, I'm nearing 2,000 followers, and on our Facebook page we just hit 1,000. So I just want to thank you all for listening, tuning in, because I know that there is, unfortunately, there is not a surplus of knowledge out there, so I appreciate you guys choosing to come here. I know there's a lot of different entities that you can go to otherwise, a lot of conservative speakers out there, but in terms of who's covering the real-life policy, who's covering some of the more out-of-the-box ideas, things that are transpiring underneath or subliminally behind the mask of government and behind the mask of some of this cultural war stuff, which I do think the culture war is very important as well to talk about, but we're just going to sit here and I'm not going to spend an entire episode talking about Mr. Potato Head or Dr. Seuss. I think that I'll reserve that time to some of the other conservative speakers, and I will just continue to harp on policy, different authoritarian mindset leaders, as well as laws or bills that are being attempted to be pushed by some of these tyrants in our government. So I do greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. I thank you that we have gotten this far in this podcast. I did not ever imagine that I would have 1,000 followers. And even on Rumble, usually my videos, we're getting viewership and listenership above the hundreds. And I greatly appreciate it. I did not imagine that would be the case a couple months ago when I started. So I was just happy to have, I told my friend when I first started this, I was just happy to have, maybe 10, 20 people tuning in and listening. And the fact that I've been shut down on Facebook, I know they're shadow banning me. I know my videos don't really get out, but somehow my memes do, or my pictures do. Those somehow get shared en masse, but my videos that I put out, that content, I've been flagged pretty much wherever I put it out. It's just not getting the same, I'm not reaching the same amount of audience members, and it doesn't make sense because my pictures will reach just as posted a minute before will reach way more people, and it has nothing to do with shares. I'm not getting anything at all. So I greatly appreciate it, and YouTube as well. YouTube has been really going at me. I have about, I think 40, 50 subscribers there. I'm going to get like a view or two on each video, so I think that they're not notifying my subscribers there, and I'm not really worried about it. I do not advertise anything from YouTube. I generally go with Rumble. Rumble has become the new free speech hub, and same thing as well on podcasts. I greatly appreciate everyone just in a general sense that listens. So I'm going to get right to it on this one. So in this paper, Madison, he lays the foundation for what the theme will be for coming papers to explain the several parts of government, in particular the legislative department or the legislative branch. And this one in particular, it's going to be the House of Representatives. So he begins talking about the House of Representatives. He states, and I quote, "They are to be the same with those of the electors of the numerous branch of the state legislatures," end quote. So when he talks about the electors, he's very brief with this. The state legislature is in charge of appointing who the electors are to be, and the House of Representatives plus the Senate are supposed to equal the amount of electors that you have, or electoral votes that you have. And this is just a very general sense. I'm not going to really go that deep into it because he's going to hit it on some later papers. This paper, in a general sense, the theme of this one is the House of Representatives and how their elections will be. I think he calls them biennial, as in every single 2 years. They'll hold every single 2 years will be their term. And he gives the reasoning and the foundation behind why that is so. So Madison, he explains, and I quote, The definition of the right of suffrage is very justly regarded as a fundamental article of Republican government. It was incumbent on the convention, therefore, to define and establish the right in the Constitution. To have left it open for the occasional regulation of the Congress would have been improper for the reason just mentioned. To have submitted it to the legislative discretion of the states would have been improper for the same reason, and for the additional reason that it would have rendered too dependent on the state governments that branch of the federal government which ought to be dependent on the people alone. End quote. So this is critical here. He says the reason the right to suffrage is and the right to vote, the reason that we threw this into the Constitution is we didn't want it to be regulated by the federal government. We also did not want it to be regulated by the states. Now, the time, manner, the approach, the method of operation in elections is actually of the state power, but the right, the freedom to vote is defined in the Constitution, and it should be adhered to, and it should not be modified to take any groups out of that right to vote. Which at this time, Black Americans were not allowed to vote. I think there was a 3/5 vote. I think they called it the 3/5 compromise. I think he gets a little bit into it later in this in the Federalist Papers. And then women as well were not able to vote. Which, by the way, the Constitution did not say strictly that women were not able to vote and Black Americans were not able to vote. That was just a way in which it was interpreted by, I guess the people that were running the government at that time. Then that's why later they were able to establish those provisions and those amendments in the Constitution, making everyone equal in terms of their voting. So, and then next he goes on, which is why it was critical or crucial that this right be defined and established in the Constitution. Madison remarks, to leave the responsibility of inculcating the right to suffrage up to the Congress or to the state governments would have made the people reliant on the government for inherent and inalienable rights. But with this inherent right, it will be the responsibility of state governments to set the standards for election in their states, because it would be far too difficult to assign this responsibility to the convention or to the union. And he explains why. He states next, and I quote, to have reduced the different qualifications in the different states to one uniform rule would probably have been as dissatisfactory to some of the states as it would have been difficult to the convention. The provision made by the convention appears, therefore, to be the best that lay with their option. It must be satisfactory to every state because it is conformable to the standard already established or which may be established by the state itself. In other words, each individual state, to have the federal government run elections from the top down, each individual state has specific demographics. They have specific citizens that have certain routines. There's a type of culture in each individual state, especially at this time. There was a type of culture. And because of that type of culture, the way in which people live their lives, let's say a lot of people work 9 to 5s, whereas, let's say in another state, a lot of people were farmers and they worked a regular 6 in the morning to 2:30. The manner and the time of elections when the polls would open would be up to the state legislatures themselves, because for that reason, to make it as available as they see fit to as many citizens as they can, to work it the way that they think is the most efficient for the people. It's the idea of a local government. It's the idea of federalism, this principle, having it set this way. And that's why currently this is under assault by H.R. 1, that they're attempting to pass through the Senate. I don't think it's going to go through. I think it's unconstitutional on its face because it is upending the federal statute, not only the statute, but upending the Constitution that specifically lays out that this is a power of the state governments to regulate their own elections, and they're handing it to the federal head. So if you want to do that, you're going to need a constitutional amendment. You are not going to need just a regular statute of law or a bill that's passed through. And that's why I think it's unconstitutional on its face, and if they go forward with a constitutional amendment, they do not have the support in the state legislative branch, and they don't even have the support in the Congress for 2/3 of a vote in the Congress. So he goes on next, he states, and I quote, it will be safe to the United States because being fixed by the state constitutions, it is not alterable by the state governments, and it cannot be feared that the people of the states will alter this part of their constitutions in such a manner as to abridge the rights secured to them by the federal constitution. End quote. So I think here what he's referring to, he's referring to the freedom to vote, the right to suffrage. The reason he's saying, so at this, if it's written in the Constitution, the states are not going to be able to alter it through their own state governments, and the people themselves aren't going to vote to get their rights taken away, is really what he's saying. So now, in today's day and age, people do vote to get their rights taken away. People voted in the last election to get their rights taken away. So unfortunately, our founders put a lot of reliance or a lot of confidence in the posterity of the nation. Unfortunately, I mean, but that does not make that document or their thought process fallible. In my eyes, what it makes it is, it makes it optimistic, and we're just not following up to the standard that they themselves created, and it's unfortunate. It's disheartening. So next, Madison, he defines the qualifications to become a United States representative, and these qualifications are exactly the same as they were years ago. So he states, and I quote, "The qualifications of the elected being less carefully and properly defined by the state constitutions and being at the same time more susceptible of uniformity have been very properly considered and regulated by the convention," as in by the federal government. "A representative of the United States must be of the age of 25 years, must have been 7 years a citizen of the United States, must at the time of his election be an inhabitant of the state he is to represent, and during the time of his service must be in no office under the United States," end quote. So if you're in the House of Reps, you're a representative, you are to hold no other position in the United States government, no other office. That is your one position, because they do not want you to be beholden to another position in the government, or be more partial in one position rather than the other. That's the reason for that. And then 25 years of age. At this time, people didn't actually live that long, so 25 was actually considered someone that was pretty established. There's a lot of people that contend that we should raise the age of running for president, as well as being a House of Rep member and a senator as well. Because I think senator is 35, president is 35 minimum, and then the House of Reps is 25. Everyone's saying we should raise that at least 10 years each position, which I don't really know. I don't know what kind of opinion I have on that, to be completely honest with you. I think it is better as you get older. You are more established. It does make sense, just because at that time the people were only living, if you were not well off, you were living a pretty short life. It was normal to have someone pass away at 55 years old from a heart attack, because they didn't know how to fix it. So he goes on here. Under these guidelines, this department of government is open to many descriptions. And he states, when he's talking about it, like the position, the reason that the House of Representatives, they set it up this way, that you're 25 years old. You don't even have to really be a citizen. You just have to be a citizen for 7 years. So you don't have to be born here. You do have to be a citizen. Whereas with the president, you actually have to be born in the United States of America. So under these guidelines, this department of government is open to many descriptions. He states, and I quote, "Whether native or adoptive, whether young or old, and without regard to poverty or wealth, or to any particular profession of religious faith," end quote. So this is a very open, and this was in the government in a general sense. This was the case. When it came to poverty, wealth, it didn't matter where you came from, what kind of money you had. This is what the American dream is. And then as well as your religious faith, you could still run. There was no type of law establishing that based off your religion or what economic class you came from that you could not run for office. There is age. That other than age and as the president of the United States being a birthright citizen, those are the only two standards to become the president of the United States. So next he goes on. He states, and I quote, let's see. Okay. He states, and I quote next, "The term for which the representatives are to be elected falls under a second view, which may be taken of this branch in order to decide on the propriety of this article. Two questions must be considered. First, whether biennial elections will, in this case, be safe, which is an election every 2 years. Secondly, whether they be necessary or useful," end quote. Because his contenders at this time they believed in actually a shorter or a longer. Some people said, 2 years is a little bit too short, don't you think? Shouldn't it be longer? And then some people thought it should be shorter, which he goes on to answer both contentions in this one. I know he definitely answers the contention of of whether it should be shorter. I don't think there was actually that many people that thought that they should be longer, but it was much more they should be shorter to keep the power out of the hands of the government, so they can't concert against the people themselves. So he states his first point. He states, and I quote, "First, as it is essential to liberty that the government in general should have a common interest with the people, so it is particularly essential that the branch of it under consideration should have an immediate dependence on and intimate sympathy with the people. Frequent elections are unquestionably the only policy by which this dependence and sympathy can be effectually secured." End quote. So he's saying the people are going to be much more reliant, or rather, the House of Representatives, the government officials, are going to be much more reliant on the people themselves because they have an election every single 2 years, so they're going to be beholden to the will of the people, and they're not going to do anything that would lose them their next election within those 2 years. So next he goes on. He states, and I quote, "But what particular degree of frequency may be absolutely necessary for the purpose does not appear to be susceptible of any precise calculation and must depend on a variety of circumstances with which it may be connected. Let us consult experience, the guide that ought always to be followed whenever it can be found. This scheme of representation as a substitute for a meeting of the citizens in person, being at most but very imperfectly known to ancient polity, it is in more modern times only that we are to expect instructive examples." End quote. So he's saying the best guide is always to use history, always to use examples, which is a common theme in making, should always be a common theme in making policy in a general sense. And then he also, interestingly enough, he says, well, it's unrealistic, it's unreasonable, or impractical to say the people themselves should be able to vote, should be their own representatives all the time, and we run a complete democracy where every single time you vote on every single issue. And that's the reason, the scheme, he says, the scheme of representation as a substitute for a meeting of the citizens in person. So every single time if you had some sort of law that was trying to be passed through, or just any bill in general sense, whether it's in your town or it's in your state, you go and vote every single time, which would be, you legitimately would be voting every single day. Or you would at least be meeting once a month. They'd probably figure some sort of system out that way. So this is the best remedy to that problem. And also, he's going to start going through examples now. He starts first off with Great Britain. He states, and I quote, "The earliest records of subsequent date prove that parliaments were to sit only every year, not that they were to be elected every year. And even these annual sessions were left so much at the discretion of the monarch, that under various pretexts, very long and dangerous intermissions were often contrived by royal ambition. To remedy this grievance, it was provided by a statute in the reign of Charles II that the intermissions should not be protracted beyond a period of 3 years." End quote. So he's saying, in the Parliament in Great Britain, they ran 3 years. Okay, so, and there's nothing saying that they are elected every year, but they're to sit only every year. I guess that was dependent on the will of the monarch at that time. The king would say, okay, well, you're allowed to sit this year, you're allowed until it comes to 3 years, and then I guess at that 3-year point, then they would actually be elected, or they'd be voted for. They would hold a vote. Then he goes on. He states, and I quote, "On the accession of William III, when a revolution took place in the government, the subject was still more seriously resumed, and it was declared to be among the fundamental rights of the people that parliaments ought to be held frequently by another statute which passed a few years later in the same reign. The term frequently, which had alluded to the triennial period settled in the time of Charles II, is reduced to a precise meaning, it being expressly enacted that a new parliament shall be called within 3 years after the termination of the former." End quote. So then next, when we get to William III, after Charles II, they have every single 3 years, they completely terminate the entire parliament, and then they vote for a brand new parliament system. So that was a little bit more freedom from the people. The people themselves had a little bit more power where it wasn't all the behest of the monarch. So he goes on. He states next, and I quote, "The last change from 3 to 7 years is well known to have been introduced pretty early in the present century under an alarm for the Hanoverian succession. From these facts, it appears that the greatest frequency of elections which has been deemed necessary in that kingdom for binding the the representatives to their constituents does not exceed a triennial return of them. End quote. So I think here he's changed. Now they go forward and they're going to change their elections to every 3 years to every 7, which really puts the liberty of the people in jeopardy. And then he goes on to explain it even further. He states, and I quote, "And if we may argue from the degree of liberty retained even under septennial elections and all the other vicious ingredients in the parliamentary constitution, we cannot doubt that a reduction of the period from 7 to 3 years with the other necessary forms would so far extend the influence of the people over their representatives as to satisfy us that biennial elections under the federal system cannot possibly be dangerous to the requisite dependence of the House of Representatives on their constituents." And end quote. So here what he's alluding to is we had a system, we saw 3 years, we saw the most freedom-minded system, 3 years, there was no problems. The people had the power. Then there was 7 years. And still there were some issues, but still the people were not being overthrown by the government with a 7-year election, or a 7-year term, rather. So I think, and we think, the proposed constitution, the Federalists, we think 2 years will definitely suffice, and it will show no danger to the liberty of the people, and it will make the members of the House of Representatives dependent on their constituents. So Madison gives additional information on the House of Commons in Great Britain and their reliance on the Crown, along with the inability of Irish Parliament to maintain the rights of their people because of the control from the Crown, he states. And now he talks about Ireland. Ireland at this time, I think, was also ruled by the British monarch too, somehow, because everything was intertwined and connected. So he states next, and I quote, "Elections in Ireland, till of late, were regulated entirely by the discretion of the Crown, and were seldom repeated, except on the accession of a new prince or some other contingent event. The Parliament, which commenced with George II, was continued throughout his whole reign, a period of about 35 years. The only dependence of representatives on the people consisted in the right of the latter to supply occasional vacancies by the election of new members, and in the chance of some event which might produce a general new election." End quote. So he's talking about the people in Ireland, how they really didn't have any power. It was all up to the discretion of the Crown. And the only time that they were actually able to vote and get new representatives in there was in the case of occasional vacancies and general new elections for special scenarios. What I'm assuming is if someone passed away, they would probably every couple years, the monarch would just select whoever was going to be in the Parliament at that time. And if something happened, some sort of contingency, someone passed away, then maybe the people got to vote. But it was very little power from the people themselves holding their representatives accountable. So he goes on. States, and I quote, "The ability also of the Irish Parliament to maintain the right of their constituents so far as the disposition might exist was extremely shackled by the control of the Crown over the subjects of their deliberation. Of late these shackles, if I mistake not, have been broken, and octennial parliaments have besides been established. What effect may be produced by this partial reform must be left to further experience. The example of Ireland from this view of it can throw but little light on the subject. As far as we can draw any conclusion from it, it must be that if the people of that country have been able under all these disadvantages to retain any liberty whatsoever, the advantage of biennial elections would secure to them every degree of liberty which might depend on a due connection between their representatives and themselves." End quote. So once they broke the shackles from Great Britain and the king there, now they have an octennial, as in every single 8 years. They hold a parliamentarian vote, a 8-year term. And this has produced further liberty because it took the king off their back. And if they're able to do it with an 8-year term, then easily America will be able to do it with a 2-year term for their representatives. Then he goes on, he starts to actually talk about the colonies before the Revolution. He states next, and I quote, "The example of these states, when British colonies, claims particular attention at the same time that it is so well known as to require little to be said on it. The principle of representation in one branch of the legislature at least was established in all of them, but the periods of election were different. They varied from 1 to 7 years. Have we any reason to infer from the spirit and conduct of the representatives of the people prior to the Revolution that biennial elections would have been dangerous to the public liberties? End quote. So what are you saying? Once there was this revolution, they had particular attention. You know what? Actually, it was before the revolution, I think he talks about it. The periods of election and their version of a legislative branch at the time require little to be said on it. The example of the states, when British Colonies, the principle, they varied from 1 to 7 years. So prior to the revolution, they held, prior to the revolution, they had a legislative branch in each individual state. And this legislative branch, they were all, throughout the states, everything was run differently. One state could have 7-year terms, the other state could have 2-year terms, the other state can have 5-year terms, everything was different. And he said those did not threaten liberty in terms of state power, state government, or colony power, I guess you would say, those people regulating themselves. The thing that was tyrannical and the thing that was oppressive was the British monarch. It was not that of the people and the self-government that was going on, I guess, at that time in the colonies. So next he goes on. He states, and I quote, "The spirit which everywhere displayed itself at the commencement of the struggle and which vanquished the obstacles to independence is the best proofs that a sufficient portion of liberty had been everywhere enjoyed to inspire both a sense of its worth and a zeal for its proper enlargement. This remark holds good as well with regard to the then colonies whose elections were least frequent as to those whose elections were most frequent. Virginia was the colony which stood first in resisting the parliamentary usurpations of Great Britain. It was the first also in espousing by public act the resolution of independence." End quote. So he uses Virginia here he's going to use Virginia next as an example, but he says, well, this is proof that liberty, even though these elections some of them were longer, some of them were shorter, liberty was still preserved because we were able to get the British government and the country off of our back, the British monarch. We were able to fight for freedom, and that little enjoyed freedom from the people spread like wildfire, like it was like an elation during a party, almost. So next, Madison, he uses Virginia as another example. He goes on. He states, and I quote, "In Virginia, nevertheless, if I have not been misinformed, elections under the former government were septennial, as in 7-year terms. This particular example is brought into view not as a proof of any peculiar merit, for the priority of those instances was probably accidental, and still less of any advantage in septennial elections, for when compared with a greater frequency they are inadmissible, but merely as a proof, and I conceive it to be a very substantial proof, that the liberties of the people can be in no danger from biennial elections." End quote. So he says in Virginia they ran every single 7 years they had an election. And because of that, the people there, their freedom is in no danger and no jeopardy if we're running 2-year elections. The shorter the election time, the better. And I think maybe it's the next paper, but he talks about how 1-year terms just would not work, how they're impractical because the person would get in and then they pretty much be kicked out, the next year, which makes sense. So Madison, he concludes with 3 reasons as it relates to the examples to support biennial elections, and these are important. I think, where's the first reason? I have the second one here. I have the second and the third, but I don't have the first one. Oh, the first, here we go. Okay, so first he states, and I quote, "The first is that the federal legislature will possess a part only of that supreme legislative authority which is vested completely in the British Parliament, and which, with a few exceptions, was exercised by the colonial assemblies and the Irish legislature. It is a received and well-founded maxim that where no other circumstances affect the case, the greater the power is, the shorter ought to be its duration, and conversely, the smaller the power, the more safely may its duration be protracted." That is a very important quote. So what he's saying is that if you have more power in government, you want to give these people shorter shorter terms so that power can't be used to attempt to overthrow the people and oppress them and take their rights and their freedoms away. If you have a position that has very little power, then the longer the term can be without jeopardizing the people's freedoms. Thus, the reasoning, we have the Supreme Court, we have life terms. That's part of the reason, I think, why. Because this time they didn't think that the Supreme Court would actually play a big role in government. Now they do, unfortunately. They do not preserve the freedoms, which is what they thought. Originally, that is what they thought, and that's what their belief and their view of the role of the Supreme Court was going to be. It was to support the people themselves. But unfortunately, that just has not been the case historically. It has not supported the people's rights. It's got it wrong many, many times. So next he's going to go on to the second place, and I think I have the third one too. Okay. In this next quote. So next he states, and I quote, "In the second place, it has on another occasion been shown that the federal legislature will not only be restrained by its dependence on its people, as other legislative bodies are, but that it will be moreover watched and controlled by the several collateral legislatures which other legislative bodies are not. And in the third place, no comparison can be made between the means that will be possessed by the more permanent branches of the federal government for seducing. If they should be disposed to seduce the House of Representatives from their duty to the people, and the means of influence over the popular branch possessed by the other branches of the government above cited, with less power therefore to abuse the federal representatives, can be less tempted on one side, and will be doubly watched on the other." End quote. This is interesting. So the first one, the second place that he says, there is no legislative body that currently under this current system, and if you look all around the world at this time, there's no legislative body that is dependent on the people this much, and also dependent on the legislative bodies of the individual states, because the states played a huge role in the thought process of their people, the beliefs of their people. And at this time, the Senate, once again, the Senate was elected through the state legislative branch. So the state legislature actually was another constituent, technically, of the federal legislature. And that was very important. That was a balance of power between state government. We often talk about this balancing of power, the three branches, what do they call it, weights and balances, or what have you. But little do we talk about the state government and how they also are a balance on the federal head as well. That's not very often discussed, and that is the case. And in the third comparison, in the third place, he talks about how no comparison can be made between the means that will be possessed by the more permanent branches of federal government for seducing. So he's saying some of these other federal government branches that are more permanent, they don't do every single 2-year elections, they don't really have that much power. So we really should not worry about them. And they should not be going to seduce the House of Representatives. They should not try to impact them, and they won't be able to, because the House of Representatives will be their constituency. Like, for example, the way he's explaining this is the judicial branch, as well as the president, the two branches. If you have the Supreme Court and then you have the president, if they wanted to get rid of House of Representative members, they have zero power to do so. So that gives the House of Representatives, or the representatives, as well as the Senate, at the same time, it gives them much more power, and it also gives them more possession and dependence on the people themselves. They're more loyal to the people because they're not worried about what the president thinks, they're not worried about the Supreme Court thinks, on keeping their position and their job in government. Their job in government is incumbent on the people, and it's dependent on the people themselves. So that's really the case that he makes there. And that's going to be it for this one. Next, I think it's same subject continued. He's going to continue to talk about it. He's probably just going to continue to defend his point, and then he might go in a little bit why there can't be 1 years. But he gets pretty deep on the legislative branch. That's where Madison goes the most in depth in this piece. So we're going to have a lot of legislative branch papers from here on out. So I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. Thank you for making the podcast as big as it has been thus far. It's only been a couple months, so I greatly appreciate that, and I will see you all, I don't even know, I'm pre-recording this one. I will see you all this weekend. Thank you.